It was a bitterly cold night when Sarah first laid eyes on Ashwood Manor. The old, dilapidated mansion stood deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. She had inherited the house from her estranged great-aunt, a woman she barely remembered. Despite its eerie reputation, Sarah was determined to renovate it and sell it for a profit. The locals had whispered about the manor for decades, speaking of strange occurrences and disappearances that had plagued the property. But Sarah didn't believe in ghost stories. She was practical, grounded, and not easily frightened. The first few days in the manor were quiet. Sarah spent her time cleaning and making lists of repairs. The air inside felt heavy, but she chalked it up to years of neglect. At night, however, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The temperature dropped drastically, and strange sounds echoed through the halls. Footsteps in rooms where no one walked, soft whispers just beyond her hearing. On the fourth night, Sarah awoke to the sound of a faint knock. Groggy, she stumbled out of bed and made her way to the front door, expecting to find a branch tapping against the window. But when she opened the door, no one was there. The wind howled, sending a shiver down her spine. She shut the door, but as she turned to go back upstairs, she froze. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway. She called, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Sarah grabbed her phone and walked cautiously toward the shadow. As she neared the end of the hall, she felt a sudden chill and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to move forward. When she reached the spot where the shadow had been, she found nothing, just the old, peeling wallpaper and dusty floors. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, trying to calm her racing heart. But as she turned to go back to her room, she heard it again. The knock. This time, it came from upstairs. Dread settled deep in her gut, but she couldn't ignore the noise. She slowly ascended the creaking staircase, gripping her phone tightly as she walked down the dim corridor. The knocking grew louder as she approached a door at the end of the hallway, a door she hadn't noticed before. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob and slowly pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, colder than the rest of the house. In the center of the room stood an old wooden crib, untouched by time. A faint cry echoed from the crib, sending a jolt of terror through Sarah. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. As she leaned over the crib, the crying stopped. The room fell deathly silent. She peered inside, expecting to find nothing but dust. Instead, there was a small, tattered doll, its porcelain face cracked and its eyes staring blankly at her. A strange symbol was carved into its chest. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut, and Sarah felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there, only a thick, suffocating darkness creeping closer. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. Panicking, Sarah grabbed the doll and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Desperate, she turned to the window, only to find it nailed shut. The whispers returned, louder now, circling her, taunting her. "You shouldn't have come," they hissed. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah hurled the doll against the wall. It shattered into a million pieces, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The door creaked open, and the air seemed to lighten. Trembling, she bolted from the room and out of the house, vowing never to return. The next morning, she drove to the nearest town, determined to learn more about the manor's history. An elderly librarian recognized the house immediately. "Ah, Ashwood Manor," she said gravely. "Your great-aunt wasn't the only one to die there. That house, it's cursed. They say the original owner, a madwoman, lost her child in that crib and went mad with grief. She practiced dark rituals, hoping to bring the child back, but she only succeeded in trapping its spirit and hers in that doll." Sarah shuddered. She never believed in the supernatural, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her, that the house wasn't done with her yet. And that night, as she lay in bed at her apartment, a familiar sound echoed through the room, the soft, rhythmic knocking. The door creaked open. Sarah froze as the door to her bedroom slowly creaked open. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her mind raced, trying to rationalize the impossible. She was miles away from Ashwood Manor. There was no way that thing could have followed her here. But as the door swung wide, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. She felt the icy grip of dread tighten around her. Her breath came out in short, panicked bursts, visible in the now frigid air. She wanted to scream, to bolt from the room, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as if an invisible force held her in place, paralyzing her with fear. The knocking began again, louder now, reverberating through the room, pounding in her ears. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Go away," she whispered, her voice shaking, barely audible over the relentless banging. "Leave me alone." But it didn't stop. Instead, the whispering returned, those same disembodied voices from the manor. They circled her, swirling like a cold wind, whispering her name. "Sarah, Sarah." In the corner of her room, a shadow shifted. Her eyes snapped toward it and her breath caught in her throat. The figure was back, the one from the hallway in the manor. Only this time it was clearer, more defined. A woman, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes and long, tangled hair. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress, stained with something dark. Sarah's phone buzzed on the nightstand, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure. It stepped closer, slow and deliberate, its bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The air grew thicker, heavy with a sense of impending doom. "Who are you?" Sarah forced the words out, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman stopped at the foot of Sarah's bed, her head tilting unnaturally to the side as if studying her. Then, in a voice that sounded like it had crawled up from the depths of the earth, she spoke. "You took it. You took my child." Sarah's blood ran cold. Her mind flashed back to the crib, to the cracked porcelain doll she had found. The symbol carved into its chest, the same one now glowing faintly on the woman's chest. "I didn't," Sarah started, but the woman's eyes flashed with rage, silencing her. The room grew darker as the shadowy figure advanced. The voices around her rose to a fever pitch, chanting in some ancient, forgotten language. The walls of her apartment seemed to ripple and distort, as though reality itself was bending under the weight of whatever malevolent force had been unleashed. Desperate, Sarah grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling to dial 911. But when she glanced at the screen, her heart sank. The wallpaper of her phone had changed. It now displayed the same eerie symbol from the doll and the woman's chest. The phone buzzed again, but this time, a message appeared. The lights flickered, and the woman was suddenly right next to her, her cold breath on Sarah's neck. With a bony hand, she reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face. "The doll was mine, the child was mine. You should have left it alone," she whispered, her voice a rasping hiss. Suddenly, the floor beneath Sarah's bed began to shake. The boards groaned and cracked, splitting open as a deep black chasm appeared beneath her. From the darkness below, more voices rose, terrified cries, sobbing, and desperate wails. She could see pale hands reaching up from the abyss, clawing at the edges of the pit, trying to pull themselves out. No, this can't be happening," Sarah gasped, backing away from the hole, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was nowhere to run. The walls seemed to close in on her, the ceiling pressing down, suffocating her with its weight. The woman's eyes gleamed with malice as she pointed toward the hole. "You're next." With a deafening crack, the floor gave way completely, and Sarah screamed as she fell into the abyss, the icy hands of the dead clawing at her, pulling her down into the darkness. Everything went black. When Sarah awoke, she was no longer in her bedroom. She was back in the manor, standing in the nursery, the shattered pieces of the doll scattered at her feet. But something was different now. She looked down at her hands. They were pale, translucent. A voice echoed in her mind, cold and final. "Now you belong to Ashwood Manor." And in the corner of the room, another figure stood, watching. It was a man, his face twisted with the same hollow-eyed expression. He stepped toward her, holding a small, tattered doll, the same one Sarah had smashed. But this time it was whole again. She tried to move, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The realization sank in, cold and terrifying. She wasn't leaving. She was trapped, just like the others, just like the woman. Sarah was now part of the haunting, and as the sun set behind the twisted trees of Ashwood Manor, the whispers began again.